Okay, welcome to the second half of the Insensibility lecture videos. So we're up to the fourth chapter of the poem. So happy the soldier home with not a notion, how somewhere every dawn some men attack and many sighs are drained. Let's have a look at these lines first of all. So happy is becoming a recurring motif. It's linked in these previous stanzas as well, but the meaning of it changes from stanza to stanza. So it's important to acknowledge that that is actually happening. Okay, and here in this section of the poem, Owen's actually referring to men that are waiting to be deployed. Okay, so every dawn some men attack, and so it's symbolic of that new day beginning, but also showing how relentless war is and how it continues on. And so we've got this somewhere and some men, and that anonymity and distance being created here as well. The sighs are drained aspect of this line acts as a euphemism for death. And these final lines here, happy the lad whose mind was never trained, his days are worth forgetting more than not, has the word lad, first of all, has youthful connotations and uses British colloquialism to make reference to these young men awaiting their training. And this final line, his days are worth forgetting more than not, makes a direct allusion to the effects of shell shock. So before these soldiers actually go off to war, they don't really have any inkling of the kinds of suffering that they might be exposed to. This wasn't the time of immediacy of finding things out within a minute of them happening like we have nowadays. So the realities of warfare were not really known to these men. Okay, so before facing the horrors of the war, most men could forget each day, and their training in the lead up to being sent off to war as fairly uneventful. But once they actually go off and see this suffering firsthand, what has been seen cannot be unseen. He sings along the march which we march taciturn, because of dusk, the long, forlorn, relentless trend from larger day to huger night. So, here these actions, singing along as he marches, reflect this naivety, this real, perhaps not ignorance, that might be too hard a word actually, but this lack of knowledge about this harsh reality, especially in contrast to these more experienced soldiers who've now been in the trenches for a while and have seen such devastation. So, definition of taciturn is almost silent or to be unresponsive. So, while the new recruits are marching along singing, the more seasoned soldiers are not. Okay, and if we think about dusk and that link back to how it's used in Anthem, and it's quite symbolically used here. So again, that idea of death being ever present, okay, constant companion, again linking back to the next war. And this would of course affect how the soldiers felt and how they operated in their day-to-day duties as well. Okay, so these final lines, the long, forlorn, relentless trend from larger day to huger night. You have successive negative adjectives here, long, forlorn, relentless, almost suggesting this monotony. It goes on and on and on. There are comparative forms being used in larger and huger to emphasize the increasing fear that soldiers felt as night approaches. Okay, and so that perhaps incorrect grammar in huger could reflect that idea of the loss of order in war. Remember, all word choices, every choice that Owen makes is deliberate. Okay. So part 5 here. We wise, who with a thought besmirch blood all over all our soul, how should we see our task but through his blunt and lashless eyes? So, first of all, collective first person pronoun being used here in reference to all poets who write about war. So Owen here is talking about himself and his contemporary poets. So besmirch is actually an archaic word, and it means to damage someone's reputation and to speak about them in a sort of not so nice way. but can also refer to making something dirty. Okay, and so here he's reverted back to his poetic self, and there's a religious allusion to souls as well, blood over all our soul, to show how the work of Owen and other poets is exposing the death of these soldiers, okay, and they're represented metaphorically by this blood, okay, that's referenced in this second line, in their efforts to expose the reality of war and the harsh conditions that these soldiers find themselves in, okay, and that devastating loss of humanity that we see in so many of his poems. Okay, and this rhetorical question here questions how else could they actually write about war other than exposing it for exactly what it is? Okay, and so that's the whole concept here, but through his blunt and lashless eyes. Okay, that idea of not emoting anymore, so connotations of numbness being suggested again, perhaps also of death as well. Okay, so Owen's asking the question, how else could we reveal the truth of what's actually happening other than through the eyes of these soldiers who have been left unable to feel or respond to anything around them? Alive, he is not vital overmuch, dying, not mortal overmuch, nor sad, nor proud, nor curious at all. He cannot tell old men's placidity from his. So you'll notice I've used blue here to highlight the nots and gnaws, and we'll get to those soon enough. But overmuch is again an archaic word referencing too much. Okay, it's pretty self-explanatory, I think. We have this use of parallelism here. Okay, where the lines themselves are not repeated, it's just that final word. Okay, and that same structure is retained, but there are some distinct contrasts being created here. So if we were to translate these lines, we would say, when he was alive, the soldiers' lives were seen as unimportant. They were just young men going about their day-to-day lives, ordinary. Once they died, they were absolutely replaceable. Okay, so when they lived, their lives were not worth all that much. When they died, they were replaced with others. Okay, so there's a clear juxtaposition being used. Okay, but the terms are correlated in terms of what that word overmuch actually means and what it's referring to. Okay, these next two lines, nor sad, nor proud, nor curious at all. So here we've got the use of anaphora, and those youthful traits have slowly disappeared. So the soldiers have, again, that question of emotional detachment becoming important here. And those final two lines, symbolic of the half-life these soldiers are now forced to live. Okay, they are without expression, without response to anything happening around them. Okay, and again, that link in the final line to premature aging that we've seen at the beginning of Dolce, for example. Okay, but that lost innocence and lost potential becomes important here as well. And so if we're thinking about a tone being established in this part of the poem, although it's pretty well pessimistic throughout, but here it becomes quite strongly pessimistic, if you like. Okay, so talks about the devaluing of soldiers' lives, whether they're in battle or not, that loss of those traits, those character traits that they would have had they survived, and this inability as well to feel their own emotions and to respond to the world around them. So that all of this is talking about loss. Okay, and so we've got this really pessimistic tone being established pretty powerfully through that repetition. Okay, in part 6. But cursed are dullards whom no cannon stuns, that they should be as stones. Wretched are they, and mean with paucity, that never was simplicity. So, as per Owen's usual MO, he is actually going for his strong finish, which is pretty standard for his style. So, first of all, there's a tonal shift. He's actually becoming quite critical, quite angry, and accusatory That means he's pointing the finger at those people back home, okay, who are sitting and making rulings, I should say, and sending these soldiers off, basically to their deaths. So there's a juxtaposition here between cursed, dullards and stupid people. So a dullard is a stupid person, directing those on the home front, directed to those, on the home front, because these were the people that supported war, also referencing those generals that sent these men off to their slaughter, because they'll never know war in the same way that the front lines of the infantry will. Okay, and Owen was never shy of pointing that out. Okay, that there were men behind the scenes that were making these decisions, whether they be generals or politicians, who never experienced any of this firsthand. So that they should be as stones. This simile refers to people that were in support of the war, and that idea of being stony is acting without compassion and arguably acting without humanity, even though they have no reason for having lost it in the first place. Okay, so a few definitions here. Wretched means extremely bad, and actually has connotations of suffering as well. And paucity is the shortfall of something. So in this case, there's a paucity of understanding or sympathy. There's no real sense that these young men's lives are valued in any real way. And so we have this internal paradigm in the final line here. So those on the home front, they're unable to care, not due to the fact that they don't have the knowledge about what's happening really, because they did to some extent, but they didn't have the emotional connection to the events in the battlefield. They didn't witness it firsthand and have those firsthand impacts, so they weren't actually able to experience it themselves or feel it themselves. By choice they made themselves immune to pity and whatever mourns in man before the last sea and the hapless stars. Okay, so we'll stop there for a moment. These three lines. So, these people became desensitized themselves. They're cut off from any sense of mercy. We've mentioned that already, but Owen is building that same imagery here. The alliteration here of whatever mourns in man shows Owen's disgust in this lack of empathy. So even soldiers dying in their thousands, I should actually write on this slide tens of thousands, the belief still was send off more men and keep fighting this fight. There's a symbolic allusion here to Greek mythology in Before the Last Sea and the Hapless Stars, as the path to death is a journey over water, and the stars are unable to guide these soldiers to any sort of final rest. So this idea that because of their immunity to these soldiers' suffering, they can't understand the loss of these soldiers' lives either. Okay, so the next line here, whatever mourns when many leave these shores, whatever shares the eternal reciprocity of tears. So first of all, euphemism is used so that there was widespread deaths of soldiers, and Owen remains unconvinced about their humanity, the humanity of those left behind, I mean. Okay, and those final two lines, these same people lack the ability to grieve or to experience the loss of these men. Okay, they were numbers on a page, year 12. They weren't seen as individuals, as people who had lost their lives, that people had, who had people at home waiting for them either. Okay, and they won't be left with that same sense of despair that the others have. They won't feel that same loss. Okay, and so in those final lines, if you like, and in this final stanza, I would argue that Owen really laments or feels sad about the fact that war really diminishes everyone's humanity, not just the soldiers themselves fighting in the battles and seeing all of those horrific things that we've seen in Owen's other poems, but also the people left behind or the people making the decisions about these soldiers, if you like, or in regards to their lives. Okay. So that ends the poem, but I do have a few more sort of general points just before we finish off here. Oh, sorry, one more definition. So reciprocity refers to an exchange or a trade. So if you have a look at these lines, whatever mourns when many leave these shores, making reference to the soldiers who die, whatever shares the eternal reciprocity of tears. So notice that repetition of whatever, okay, and that extends Owen's cynicism here, okay. He's saying that there is no real sense of trade. Really, it's a one-way trade, okay. Those men go off and they give up their lives and they get nothing in return.